On this episode of Technicolor Blood, Terrence and I will discuss Paul Schrader's First Reformed at length.
It's an eco-thriller.
We are back for another episode of Technicolor Blood. My name's Chris. I'm here as always with Terrence. Terrence, are you ready to talk about First Reformed?
I am. I'm looking forward to talking about it. We both watched it, and I knew absolutely nothing at all about this movie going into it.
Yep, I was pushing for us to watch this one because, just a little bit of background, it was written and directed by Paul Schrader. He was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay for an Oscar, or I'm sorry, Best Screenplay for an Oscar for this movie. It was his first ever. It was his first ever Academy Award nomination.
So at the time of this recording, we don't know if it's going to win or not.
Correct. So he most famously wrote Taxi Driver, which is my all-time favorite movie and one of Terrence's. And probably if I didn't love it so much, Terrence, it might be his favorite movie, but I kind of stole it from him. So
yeah,
there's that. And he also wrote the screenplay for Raging Bull. He wrote American Gigolo. He actually directed American Gigolo too. He actually wrote the screenplay for The Mosquito Coast, which I think is a pretty good underrated movie from the 80s that not a lot of people have seen, and a bunch of others. He wrote and directed Affliction in the 90s, Bring Out the Dead. He wrote that, directed by Martin Scorsese. Several other movies. I'm leaving out a lot. Oh, I guess another notable one to bring up. He wrote the screenplay for the very controversial The Last Temptation of Christ. So obviously a long time Martin Scorsese collaborator. So he directed this movie. It stars Ethan Hawke, who had kind of a big independent film year this year. He did Blaze.
He's been busy.
Yeah.
Sure.
And Ethan Hawke is one of those guys who's kind of hit and miss for me over the years, but in his age, I think he's taking better roles, or maybe, I don't know, he's better. I don't know. So First Reformed is a movie about a priest in a small town church in New York. The church is called First Reformed Church, and he is a father who had, this really isn't part of you don't see this during the movie, but his son, spoilers throughout the entire show, by the way, if you haven't seen this movie, spoilers. He had a son, and he had a wife and son. His son went off to war. He encouraged his son to go off to war, and his son died in the war. His marriage fell apart as a result of that. He became a priest at this church, and the rest of the story basically follows him sort of interacting with a young woman and her young husband. They had just recently gotten pregnant, and the young man he was an environmental activist, and kind of the world is crashing around him and mentally, and he's having a really hard time. So he's trying to help them through their issues. That's kind of the setup to the movie.
Yes. So
I guess overall, I'll have to say that I think this is the kind of movie that if I'd seen this when I was younger, I think I probably would have really liked it, because I just really like dark, sort of depressing, descent into madness kind of stories. And I still do. But this movie was so bleak.
Yes.
And it had not one single moment of levity in the entire movie. I don't think there was a single moment of levity. I don't think.
Yeah. Despite one of the cast members being Cedric the Entertainer.
Yes, that is quite notable.
And let's not gloss that over. It's Cedric the Entertainer, and he's acting like he is playing a full-blown character in a drama.
Yeah. So I got to say, I didn't really like this movie. I liked elements of the movie here and there, but as far as the sum of its parts, man, it was just, and again, it's not because it's bleak and it's not because it's depressing. It just, man, I don't know why he made this movie, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Paul Schrader is known to be, I mean, he famously wrote Taxi Driver while basically living in a bathtub strung out on heroin. So, Terrence and I had no delusions about what this movie was going to be. Terrence said he didn't know anything about it, but he knew it was Paul Schrader. Yeah. So we weren't going to come out of it uplifted.
Yeah. And I mean, the parallels to Taxi Driver are, it is.
I have a page of notes.
Yeah. It's indisputable that he is revisiting everything from Taxi Driver for this film.
Yeah, it's basically it's Taxi Driver with a priest.
Yeah.
So
and I mean, a less talented director, right? Paul Schrader directing it himself versus Martin Scorsese directing it, and it's a night and day difference.
Oh yeah, it's a big difference. Now I don't dislike Schrader's directing style. It's definitely not.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah, it's definitely not anything on par with what Scorsese did with Taxi Driver. He has a very I don't know if subtle's the right word. He likes static shots. Mm-hmm. He likes very slow, pushing in, pushing out. Like I like that kind of stuff. He did a great job, I thought, of setting up a lot of really beautiful static shots just in a home, just of a bed, mm-hmm. A perfectly made bed, because this character that Ethan Hawke played, Pastor Toller, was a very regimented guy, and he had his little routine, which sort of is one of the first things that feeds right into Taxi Driver. In fact, the very first thing that happens in the movie is Toller is keeping a journal, mm-hmm. which was a theme that strung through the entire film for Taxi Driver. Mm-hmm. And I apologize if you haven't seen Taxi Driver. Number one, you should absolutely see it. And there's just going to be a lot of talk about the similarities between these two movies. So, like I said, my overall impression was I liked parts of the movie, but as a whole, I don't know what the point of the movie was. I don't know what pushed him to make it, other than I want to get my misery out on screen.
Right. Yeah. I think, I definitely echo that sentiment. As you're watching this film, you can tell that it's going to go somewhere, and you get some hints as to where it's going to go. And you have a certain expectation for how this film might end. And the director turns that on its head, but he turns it on its head in a pretty ludicrous way. Like, I just thought the end of this movie completely unraveled. And I felt like at some point in the making of this film, Paul Schrader realized, I don't have an ending for this movie, so I'm instead going to just try to art my way out of it and create some weird visuals and throw in some ambiguity about everything I've established in the movie. And then I'm going to have a bunch of characters behave in ways that make no sense to the way they were behaving earlier in the film.
If those things even actually happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
which is a criticism. Because
of the weird artsy ambiguity, you're no longer certain what did or did not take place in the film.
And it's funny because we just talked last week about Enemy, and we talked about ambiguous endings. And I don't have a problem with ambiguous endings at all. No. And I don't have a problem with endings that don't end the way that you think they're going to end. Mm-hmm. But Paul Schrader put so much effort into coiling this ending. It was just a huge ball of twisted metal energy that was just that was being compressed so much, and it was just going to explode into a like the Big Bang, like the whole idea of the Big Bang Theory. That's what the whole movie felt like. You could feel the tension. I could feel my muscles tensing, and when you do that, you just can't end the movie the way they ended it. You just can't. No. Now, again, I'm fine with ambiguous endings, but not when you are clearly headed down one road and then you just pull the rug out at the end. I just thought that was, like you said, he had no idea how to end it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they tested multiple endings. Probably not with indie movies. It's probably not how that works.
Right.
But man, the way they went with it, I did not like. But again, the ambiguity of the ending was another callback to Taxi Driver.
Yes.
There's a very famous scene at the end of Taxi Driver where he gets back in the cab and Betsy gets in the car behind him, and something happens with the rearview mirror, and there's this weird sound cue, and there's all kinds of speculation. Was he alive? Was he dead? What happened in the previous scene? And that's exactly sort of the impression I got from the end of First Reformed.
See, I feel very differently about that. I feel like there is a definite, unambiguous ending to Taxi Driver, to the story that is being told in Taxi Driver. After that, there is an interesting, ambiguous moment with the character that, leads you to kind of wonder what's going on with him. But the actual events of the movie are completely resolved
Sure.
in a very fulfilling and correct way in terms of they play by the rules that they've established earlier in the film.
Right. Yep.
In the case of this movie, it just
You don't even get that.
yeah, no, there's a moment in the film where a switch gets flipped and it becomes a different movie from that point forward than it was leading up to that.
Yeah.
And it just felt like a different movie. Like it felt like if I were to find out that they had shot 4 different endings for this movie, that would make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And, this was just one of the many options that when they were kind of grasping around for how to resolve this story.
Right.
And they went with this because it was, to their mind, to Paul Schrader's mind, the most artistic, the most visionary ending. Okay, maybe. But I don't know. I was not impressed with how it wrapped up.
Yeah. With Taxi Driver, the ambiguous part is basically it's a coda.
Yes.
You have the wrap up of the movie, and then
Correct.
you have that ambiguous part after. With this, you don't get the wrap up. You just get the ambiguity, I guess, and it just wasn't.
And there's no preparation for you. Like, the movie is rooted in this particular world and this particular storytelling style with these characters behaving in a way that you can trust.
Yeah.
And then something happens, which, as you said, there's spoilers. So there's this like visionary sort of mind trip that the character goes on.
Yep.
And
Out of nowhere.
yeah, out of nowhere. It's completely unexpected. And it visually, it looks unlike anything else in the movie. And after that moment happens, nobody quite behaves the way that you were expecting them to behave based on how those characters were written prior to that moment in the film.
So there's really a lot I'd like to talk about with this movie. So let me just start throwing some things out. Do you think this was a environmentally preachy movie?
Yes.
See, I didn't think it was.
Okay.
I thought I think the vast majority of people that see it are gonna say that.
Mm-hmm.
But he had no interest or frame of reference for any of that stuff. The Ethan Hawke character, Pastor Toller, I feel like sort of almost like with Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, it was a cause for him to throw himself into because he was mentally deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't care about any of that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but he took up that fight in a way to, right some wrongs that he feels like, the whole thing where he talks about, will God forgive us? Will God forgive us? And I think he also had a lot of doubts about what he did for a living as well, intertwined with that. So while the movie does have like sort of the stuff that looks like preachy environmental stuff, and I mean, obviously they spent some budget on that, and that sort of like mind trip part you were talking about, there's all these like cool shots of, horrible things happening to the environment, like these drone shots or whatever, and very, very bleak. But I just feel like that was just whatever he needed to do to get to the end of this movie, the character.
Yeah, but you asked me if I thought the movie was environmentally preachy.
So you thought it was preachy.
Yeah. I thought Paul Schrader
Okay.
chose this topic so that he could include, he's got multiple characters who like spout facts and figures about, climate change and, how the earth will, be unlivable by 2050 or whatever,
Sure.
whatever the details are. And it's fine. It's germane to the plot that he's written. I didn't really have a problem with it, but I mean, I definitely feel like that was a drum that he was beating while he was making this film.
I mean, throughout the entire thing, like
Yeah.
you never really got a break from it.
Yeah.
Down to the sort of like, billionaire asshole guy
Sure.
who
Yeah.
did not give a damn about, anything except his own pocketbook.
Yeah. I mean, spoiler, the businessman turns out to be the villain.
Yeah. Big surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just thought it was interesting how that character just threw himself into something that he showed no signs of caring about at all. That's what I mean. Like, yeah, I guess the movie itself, the way it's presented, he's certainly getting that stuff out there so that people will see his point of view. But the character was just empty of any of that. So I don't know if I don't want to ever say poor writing because it's Paul Schrader, or if it was more of a function of that character just he needed something to dump himself into, and that was the means to an end.
Yeah. I think you're right about that.
Okay.
And I'm certain that was deliberate.
Yeah. So yeah, that scene, you knew this movie was going to be dark and knew there was going to be some shocking things, but the scene where Pastor Toller finds Michael Mancena, I think is his name, is the young husband of the Amanda Seyfried character in the park. I mean, that was just a shocking turn of events. And
he had committed suicide, shot his head off with a shotgun.
Yeah, and they didn't avoid showing the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
So that sort of sets things in motion. And then the wife character I thought was fairly interestingly played by Amanda Seyfried, because she was clearly upset, but I thought she did a good job of also almost seeming like she was relieved. Like she knew that this was she knew from living with him that this was going to be a thing for years.
Yeah.
Like she could see him going off the deep end. And I almost felt like she played that role as if she felt like, okay, well, it's better to rip the Band-Aid off. This is sorted now, because she was devastated, but she also, I just felt like she did a good job of getting across that she was sort of glad to be past that chapter of her life, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, we should take a step back and just say that in my opinion, all of the acting in this film is extraordinary. Like everyone is very, very good. With
Ethan Hawke was awesome in this movie.
Yeah, Ethan Hawke is great, but the supporting cast I thought was especially good. Amanda Seyfried is very, very good with the part that she's given. Mm-hmm. And yeah, yes. Again, I feel like her character is also an example where when the shift happens in this movie, she proceeds to do something that seemed very out of place for the way they had, set that character up. But at the same time, you expect it as a result of just Hollywood. Listen, if you see a priest in a movie, one of two things is going to happen, right? Number one, most likely there's going to be an exorcism, right? That is the number one use of a priest in Hollywood movies. If there is nothing supernatural in that movie, then 100% that priest is going to do sex to somebody. that was an odd Freudian slip. But the caveat to this film is that he's not a Catholic priest, so he is allowed to marry, and we know that he's sexually active. Mm-hmm.
He does sex, as you said.
Yes, he does sex to people. But so, because that's a requirement in Hollywood for the priest character, and you've got this character who a third of the way into the movie is suddenly a widow, you're like, well, you hit the stopwatch and you just wait.
Yep.
And, it eventually does happen. But again, the route that both those characters are playing seems to be going in one direction, and then there's the trippy mind voyage that he goes on, and after that suddenly they're both on a completely different path,
which didn't even involve drugs.
No, it did not.
That was a very odd choice. Now I give him credit for putting something in the movie that I never would have conceived would have happened. I don't know that I felt there was any sort of weird sexual tension between those two early on in the movie.
I did not.
Yeah, and then that happened, so that seemed a bit sudden to me. But I mean, when you're dealing with a death, I mean, you behave in a way sometimes that obviously wouldn't be yourself. So, she was seeking some comfort, I guess, because he asked her, hey, did you want to do that? When she explained the whole mind trip thing to him, it didn't seem like she was angling for that to happen. She was just explaining it. And he just because he was, there were no drugs, but he was drunk. He had been drinking.
You need to remind the audience members, like what they have to do to initiate the mind trip.
Right. So the Mary Mancena character, Mary, who is pregnant. It's more religious stuff going on there. Anyway, I assume Paul Schrader was a Catholic or something because the guy's got issues.
Yeah, probably. That makes sense.
Anyway, so she comes over. This is after her husband has killed herself and she's not doing well. And she comes to Pastor Toller's home, which is very sparsely decorated with exposed light bulbs. Taxi driver. And she comes over and she's seeking some comfort, which just seems like she's looking for some discussion. And she tells Pastor Toller about this thing that she and her husband used to do, which is her husband would lay on the ground flat or on a bed. I don't know how they did it, with their arms and legs flat on the ground. And Mary would lay facing him right on top of him, just basically like a mirror image of him with, and I think she actually used the phrase, we have our bodies touch as much as possible. So nose to nose, arm to arm, leg to leg, body to body. And they just look at each other intently and they take long, deep breaths. And I think she maybe mentioned something about like they move their eyes slowly left to right or something.
Yeah.
So they explain that thing, which I don't know if that's a thing. Maybe it's a thing. I have no idea.
I don't think
I've never heard of it. No. Do you want to try it?
No,
okay,
I do not.
I'm just making sure. And so she's explaining this, and because Pastor Toller is a little tipsy from the drinking he's been doing, he's like, "Did you want to try that?" Just kind of throws it out there, and she's like, "No, no. Oh well, okay, I guess." So there's this kind of weird tension there, and that's when I thought, "Oh, okay, this is going somewhere more than I thought it was." So they do this, and once they do this, it's actually, it's shot very interestingly. They're very close up on their faces touching, and it's super awkward. And you're like, wow, this is actually doing the trick to make me uncomfortable. And then they start levitating.
Yeah.
And there's, I'm sure, as you can tell, there's no sci-fi element to this movie whatsoever out of the ordinary element to this whatsoever until that happens. So they start levitating, and then they go on this journey across the earth and universe together, literally, which was very strange and off-putting. I didn't have a problem with it because I like crazy avant-garde filmmaking and all that, but like you said, the movie sort of changed after that.
Yeah, and the movie resolves itself at the end with a moment that visually sort of suggests that these two characters complete each other, and they've found each other, and they're going to bring solace to each other. But there's no getting around the fact that Ethan Hawke is a terrible human being.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is a woman that has lost her husband because he killed himself, and she's turning to her pastor for help. Yeah, and she's pregnant. She's turning to her pastor for help, and he preys on her.
Yeah. She's as vulnerable as she can be.
Yeah, absolutely. And this guy who should be, just lending support and helping her is doing that, but also takes advantage of her. And the movie is sort of wrapped up in a way that suggests that somehow this is a good thing for both characters.
But did that happen? Well, do you think it happened?
I don't know.
No, I don't know either. I'm just throwing stuff out because obviously that ending was batshit.
So what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that at the point that the peyote trip happens, that we enter some sort of...
No. Less overthinking that. Just very simply, like, I'll just throw this out. Maybe he actually drank the Drano.
Okay.
And as he's dying, the last thing he sees is what he wants, which is for he and Mary to be together. And so they approach, they embrace, and they have a kiss because... And I guess my backup to this is, in the context of the movie, he is supposed to be overseeing and I guess sort of emceeing, that's not the right word, things that, he's presenting this this event that's happening at his church for the 250th anniversary of things that happened there. I'm
excellent. Well done.
I'm doing well enough to remember some of the names. Okay, so God, it's been less than 24 hours since I've seen it. So anyway, so he's supposed to be in charge of this. There's like hundreds of people there, and it's a big event. Like there are politicians there. Blah blah blah. So he's supposed to be there, and he has planned to blow himself up at this church, kill himself, and presumably the billionaire bad guy named Edward Block, who's played by Michael Gaston. Presumably he's targeting him, hopefully not others, but certainly others would die in that small, tiny church, which is another thing where I'm just like you said, he's a terrible person. Yeah. Not just because of his sexual predator nature at the end, but anyway. So he's supposed to be there, and he's late, but he lives in the residence that's attached to the church. He's right next door to it. So everyone's looking for him. They're looking for him. They can't find him. He's late. So he sees that that Mary is there at the church. He had told her not to come to this. He did not want her to come because obviously he was going to do something terrible. He looks out the window, sees her going in. So when he sees that happen, he undoes his... There's a suicide vest in this movie, by the way. He undoes the vest and starts freaking out about what he's going to do next. At that point, he goes and he wraps himself in barbed wire that he had found earlier from barbed wire that was protecting the graveyard outside the church. And he puts on his white priest outfit robe thing. I was not raised religious, so forgive me.
A robe is a robe.
It's a robe, yeah. So there's a song early in the movie about the blood of the lamb and is your clothing white and pristine. So clearly call back to that. So he's wrapped himself in barbed wire. He puts the thing over him. He's bleeding through it, and he pours himself a nice glass of refreshing Drano. And he takes the glass to take a drink of the Drano, and as soon as he does that, Mary walks in the door to his home. Now, again, the context here is he's late for this thing, And her reaction to everything that happens once she walks in is nothing that a real person would have a reaction to there.
Yeah.
She doesn't immediately say, hey, where are you? Everyone's waiting for you. She doesn't say, hey, what's wrong? Is everything okay? She stands in the entryway to his home. He drops the Drano. And so what I'm saying is she never actually came in the room. He just drank the Drano, and he looked over and he saw what he wanted to happen, which is they share an embrace, because inexplicably they start kissing passionately.
Right.
As the camera sort of circles around them, and they're embracing, and I mean, he's covered in, I mean, the blood has seeped through his white robe. She can see that. She's not reacting like a person who sees a mentally unstable person who's bleeding.
Right.
So my sort of just loose theory is that he actually did drink the Drano, or in some other way harmed himself. And those last few moments of his life, he's looking at the big open space of his living room and seeing sort of like his fantasy of how he wishes this would have wrapped up.
Listen, that salvages the way that film unravels at the end to some degree. So I'm totally willing to embrace that as a possible explanation for it.
I'm not really saying it's a good ending. I'm just saying that's
it's better than the ending we got.
It's my working theory.
Yeah.
So yeah, before we sort of start wrapping it up here, I guess I do actually, just for fun, I want to go through the list of things that I wrote down of the similarities of Taxi Driver, since I love that movie so much. But before that, so I feel like we sort of feel the same about this movie. The direction, I liked parts of. What did you think of his directing style?
I really liked it. He because the setting is this Spartan 250-year-old church, like his directing style is sort of, it gives you, I don't know, the sense of that kind of old Puritan Christian sort of no frills. You're not really allowed to enjoy things because that's sort of a sin. Like his directing style captured that, and I really liked that. I thought what he did as a director was perfect for the film he was telling.
Mm-hmm. And what about the screenplay?
Well, again, I mean, it just, to me, it just completely falls apart at the end, It
shocks me that now this is not really a comment on the quality, but it shocks me that the same Academy that put First Reformed screenplay up for Best Original Screenplay for an Oscar is the same Academy that put like Black Panther up for Best Picture. Mm-hmm. That's just crazy to me. Like, I'm glad that Paul Schrader exists, and I'm glad that there's a place for his style and his directing. Mm-hmm. But I wish I'd known. I'd like to know. I need to read an article about this movie that has an interview with Paul Schrader, because I want to know what his motivation was for it. It's just so bleak and it's so awful. Mm-hmm. And there has to be, at his age and his accomplishments, there has to be more to what he wants to accomplish than just to get this misery on screen.
I mean, maybe like we talked about previously, he keeps revisiting the themes of Taxi Driver. Yeah. Taxi Driver, obviously, Bring Out Your Dead is very similar to Taxi Driver as well. And now this is, I mean, just parallel to Taxi Driver. He's clearly got this demon on his back that he can't let go of, and he keeps making films about.
Filmmakers all the time, guys who the composers and directors and writers very often revisit their wheelhouse themes.
Right.
I've never seen an example, a more intense example of someone aping their own style than First Reformed and Taxi Driver.
Right.
Like if this was a movie made by someone else, it would have enraged me, because it would be stealing. Mm-hmm. Like, it would literally be stealing.
Yeah.
But he stole so much from himself that I'm just curious, like, what motivates someone to not, like, revisiting the theme is one thing, but I'll go through some of these.
Yeah. Let's do that.
All right. So there's some real obvious ones, like he kept a journal the entire time. Mm-hmm. That was very introspective, and you could see that there's something not right with this character.
And even some of the journal entries he makes are, I mean, very, very similar to the ones Travis Bickle makes in Taxi Driver.
So he put booze in his cereal.
My favorite, because that is an awesome scene when Travis Bickle pours the peach schnapps onto a cereal in Taxi Driver, and Ethan Hawke does the same. There
was that. Just the overall sort of theme of him helping a much younger girl who needs his help. He lives in very sparse conditions, like we talked about, exposed light bulbs, There's a scene where things are really starting to go off the rails, where it's a static shot shooting straight on, and Ethan Hawke is walking back and forth out of frame. That is straight out of Taxi Driver.
Yes.
There's a shot of where Pastor Toller is laying in his bed with his he's fully clothed. He's got his legs kind of cocked to the side, and the shot is over the top of the bed straight down. That is directly from Taxi Driver.
Right.
There's a scene where he pours Pepto-Bismol into his drink, which in Taxi Driver it's Alka-Seltzer. And not only is that the same thing that's happening, the shot was the exact same shot. It's this slow, barely over the head of the glass shot that pushes in slowly as the Alka-Seltzer dissolves. And he does the exact same thing in this, but with Pepto-Bismol and booze. He has a portion of his journal entry where he's kind of going through about his sort of health checklist and about how he needs to, get healthier, needs to like fix the issues with him.
Right.
There's that whole thing, in Taxi Driver, he's talking about, no more destroyers of my body, no more bad food. There's the whole overarching assassination plot that he's obviously planning to kill this guy. There's the part in Taxi Driver where Travis Bickle thinks about how he might have stomach cancer, and this character literally has some kind of a horrible thing going inside his body. There's the scene where he's driving around at night and looking around downtown, and there's one shot that is shot exactly the same as Taxi Driver, and it's the same shot that the director of You Were Never Really Here aped from Taxi Driver that I mentioned a few weeks back. It's the same shot. So there's that shot, and then also in that scene, they're sort of playing with the fuzzy lights. There's like the sort of out of focus lights. Same thing in Taxi Driver. There's just a lot of lighting and angles and similar setup, lockdown shots from Taxi Driver throughout the entire thing. There's the scene where Travis Bickle he shows up with a mohawk. They don't actually show that in Taxi Driver, I don't think, but in First Reform he shaves right before the day before the attack is supposed to happen, which is also sort of I think supposed to go into the fact that a lot of terrorists sometimes shave their entire body before a terrorist attack. So that's sort of similar to seeing Taxi Driver. And then there was also the sort of aborted assassination attempt. In Taxi Driver, he goes to shoot the guy and he reaches into his vest and he gets noticed by one of the Secret Service guys. So he has to kind of abort the entire thing and run back to his place.
Right.
And again, in this one, he like gets pissed off. He rips the vest off. He starts drinking more. I mean, it couldn't be more like Taxi Driver.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Like I started taking notes, and at some point, I couldn't type fast enough. There were so many. Like I'm trying to watch the movie, but I'm also taking all these notes, and I'm just like, God, I have to actually watch this so we can talk about it also.
Basically, I think kind of what we're saying is the only people who should watch this movie are people who love Taxi Driver. That's
another thing. And my wife actually said this, like, who would you recommend this movie to? Not even like, let's say it was great. Even if it was good, like how and why would you hey,
if it was great, I would recommend it to everyone.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean? Like it's so the themes are, it's so bleak, and bleak is fine. I love bleak, man. I've spent a whole lifetime being bleak. I love it. It's great. But it's just, I don't know any movie. Like I would never recommend this to a movie fan, like a friend of mine who's a movie fan, ever. Now even people I know who are like filmmaking fans, which is a different thing to me. Filmmaking fans, even most of them, I wouldn't recommend it to. And I mean, had I seen this before you, I wouldn't have recommended it to you either, except for maybe the idea of like, hey, you need to see all the crazy Taxi Driver parallels.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. I mean, it's just.
It's a lot.
It's a movie that reaches for something, struggles for something, but doesn't just fall a little short. Like it falls substantially short.
Yeah, and I guess before we wrap it up, I do want to talk one more thing about Ethan Hawke's performance. I thought he was so great in this role.
Right.
And one thing that I thought that sort of came to my mind about halfway into it was he did this great thing. And again, I didn't grow up religious, so I don't know this, but I figured out what his struggle was. Obviously, his struggle is dealing with things that happened in his past with his son and his family. But the thing that he struggled with throughout this entire movie was helping people versus comforting people. And you could tell that he was totally comfortable comforting people, but he didn't know how to help people. He couldn't even help himself.
Yeah.
He was such a mess. And early on, I liked the way that they sort of played with that, because he was like, oh, yeah, I'll talk to so-and-so. But at first he was like, well, how about this other person at this other church? Or how about this other person? You know, he realized right away that this wasn't one of those things where he would just sit down with someone and be like, well, you know, God's got your back or whatever, you know, and have a 2-minute conversation and I'll pray for you. And he realized it was going to be work. And he realized that this person was in trouble, and he was super uncomfortable with that. And I thought that was an interesting choice, either by him or by Paul Schrader, to sort of draw that line between actually helping somebody and just being there for them and comforting them a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And Ethan Hawke, you know, in addition to just being a really great performance on his part, you have to respect the trajectory of his career, in that he is an actor who only makes the movies he wants to make. He knows he's a talented actor, and there's a handful of directors who really respect his ability. And so he only works with them or makes stuff himself. You know, he has no interest in being in popular mainstream movies if he's just going to have to play like a generic action character or whatever. And a lot of actors go into acting thinking they're going to be that guy, but it's real hard to make a living really being that guy. And he's one of the very, very few that's pulled that off over the entire course of his career. And I really respect that about him. For sure.
He's one of those guys that, and like I said, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like he's a better actor now than he was early in his career.
Yeah, I would agree
so
with
the
that.
combination of his, you know, I guess integrity is the right word, but that's not to say that it's not that the other actors who do bigger movies don't have integrity. That's not what I'm saying. But just his singular focus on, you know, independent filmmaking and not being a part of these huge movies that are literally just there to make money. I respect that, and I'm really interested to see the combination of that attitude plus the fact that I think he's just improved so much of an actor going into this, you know, later stage of his career. He's only, I think, in his mid-40s, so he's got decades left.
Yeah,
and I'm really excited to see, you know, where his career goes from here.
Yeah, I hope some directors see this movie and appreciate the performance that he turns in, and we get to see him in things that will actually be seen by people.
Yeah.
No one is going to see this movie, you know?
Right.
And it's a shame because the performance is so good. But hopefully it will lead to him being able to do an equally good performance in something people will see.
Yeah. I've committed myself to watching more independent movies this year. And thing that happens so much with independent movies is you'll see a great performance, but sort of a forgettable movie. And this movie to me is not really forgettable, but it also wasn't, you know, one that I thought was really good.
Yeah.
So it was almost, it's, for me, I'm sure it's going to be unforgettable because of the Taxi Driver stuff and because there's just so much batshit things that happened that I didn't see coming. But it's not one that I'll probably ever want to see again.
Yeah. So to wrap up, what grade would you give this film?
I will probably just give this a solid C.
Okay.
C plus. I can't ignore. Well, I can't ignore. I think it was well made. Like, it looked nice. I liked Schrader's directing style. I liked Ethan Hawke in it. So I'd have to probably put it around, C plus, B minus.
Okay. You're going to be a lot more generous than I am.
Okay.
I would probably give it a D.
Okay. I was waffling there. So C plus is my score.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay.
This is a movie that, like you were saying earlier, I would not recommend this movie to anyone. And as a result, I've got to give it a really low score. Yep. And it's a shame because the acting from everyone, including Cedric the Entertainer for that matter, is top notch. Like, all the actors do their jobs brilliantly. They're just doing it for a film that ultimately lets all of them down.
Sure. Yeah, it's I'll be interested to see how time remembers this one. There was some snub talk about, Ethan Hawke not getting nominated for an Oscar for this. So we'll just have to see what his next projects are, and like I said, I'll be interested to see where his career goes, and I'll be curious to see what Paul Schrader does next. But I'm sure it'll just be more bloodletting.
Yeah.
I just feel like he's opening up a vein and just flinging it all over all of us.
Well,
anyway, so you wouldn't
delightful.
recommend the movie, but you would definitely recommend a podcast about the movie, right?
Yeah, definitely.
For sure, you should.
Yeah, and listen, the one of you who stuck all the way to the end of this, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Ethan. All right, so so if you would promote a podcast of the movie, you can do that on iTunes, or if you could leave us a review on whatever streaming or whatever service you use to listen to the podcast, that'd be really helpful. Or you can always hit us up on Twitter @TechBloodPod and let us know maybe another movie you'd like us to watch and check out and give our review on, or any other topic you'd like. And we'll be happy to talk to you on the next one, guys. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot.